Good afternoon. Welcome to the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. My name is Sushma Raman, and I'm the Executive Director here at the Carr Center. My colleague Mathias, Risse, and I welcome you, our audience, and our distinguished speaker to today's conversation as part of our Fierce Urgency of Now series. We've covered a range of concerns at the intersection of economic and racial justice over the past month, all featuring speakers who are people of color or from the global South. This series aligns with a class that Mathias and I co-teach on economic justice theory and practice, but it is also open to the public, and we are delighted to welcome a global audience today. In 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. said, "We are now faced with the fact that tomorrow is today." We are confronted with the fierce urgency of now. In this unfolding conundrum of life and history, there is such a thing as being too late. This is no time for apathy or complacency. This is a time for vigorous and positive action. It's both sobering and inspiring to reflect on these words today as we think about how far we still have to go to achieve a more just society. In our class this coming week on labor justice, we'll be reading philosopher Elizabeth Anderson, whose lectures highlight the mismatch between free market theory and reality, and the rise of the modern industrial firm, which amounts to a system of arbitrary and accountable private government, in her words. Our conversation today is with a leader who's looking to transform an entire industry, not just one corporation, by taking on a range of economic and social injustices, increasing minimum wage, which is as low as $2.13 an hour for tip minimum wage, challenging sexual harassment, creating safe working environments, and ending racial discrimination. Saru Jayaraman is the president of One Fair Wage, launched to end all sub-minimum wages in the country, and director of the Food Labor Research Center at the University of California at Berkeley. She's also the co-founder of Restaurant Opportunity Center United, a national advocacy group created in the aftermath of 9/11 with displaced restaurant workers. It now consists of more than 600 restaurant owners, 25,000 workers, and 15,000 consumers. She's the author of Behind the Kitchen Door, Forked, a New Standard for American Dining, and Bite Back, People Taking on Corporate Food and Winning. Saru, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. It's a pleasure to be back with the Kennedy School. As some people know, I went to the Kennedy School a million years ago in the middle of law school at Yale, and it was definitely much more fun than law school. Well, would you like me to jump in, Sushma? As Sushma said, I began this work shortly after being at the Kennedy School and law school. I was working as an immigrant worker organizer in Long Island, New York when 9/11 happened. And on September 11th, there was a restaurant at the top of the World Trade Center, Tower 1. On that morning, about 73 workers died, and about 13,000 restaurant workers lost their jobs in the months and weeks following the tragedy. It's interesting over the last couple of months how we've felt so many similarities to that moment in New York City post 9/11 and this pandemic moment. Although it was one city, still millions of people lost their jobs, restaurants closed permanently during that period, people had died. It was a catastrophic moment in New York that led to something amazing, which was we created this relief center in the aftermath of the tragedy called the Restaurant Opportunity Center, and it grew from a relief center post 9/11 into a national organization fighting to raise wages and working conditions in the restaurant industry. And through the course of that work, I had always been an academic on the side, teaching at various universities, NYU, Brooklyn College, now Berkeley. And so we were engaged in one of my favorite words, which is praxis. We were organizing, we were building power, we were striking, we were engaging with restaurant owners who actually agreed with us. And at the same time, we were studying the industry, documenting what was happening, using everything we learned at the Kennedy School in terms of statistics and economics to really put out, at this point, we've put out over 100 reports and 3 books on the industry. And what we learned through what we call participatory research, training workers to conduct, at this point, over 10,000 surveys of their fellow workers in the industry. What we learned is that the restaurant industry right now is the second largest, or I should say right before the pandemic, has been the second largest and absolute fastest growing sector of the US economy. 13.6 million workers nationally. 1 in 10 American workers prior to the pandemic worked in the industry. 1 in 2 Americans, all Americans, worked in the industry at some point in their lifetime. I don't know, Sushma or Mathias, if you ever worked in restaurants in your youth, but most Americans have. And that fact that you've got the largest and fastest growing industry is unfortunately coupled with the fact that it's also the absolute lowest paying employer in the United States of America. And even if you couldn't care less about those workers who are the lowest paid workers in America, even if you're not that worried about them, still you have to worry, hopefully, if you care about broader policy or the state of our economy or our democracy, what it means for a nation when the nation's largest and fastest growing sectors are the absolute lowest paying. It means that we as the restaurant industry, through our growth, have been almost single-handedly growing the low-wage floor of the economy. These are the jobs that have been available to all new entrants, whether they're immigrants, people coming out of incarceration, young people entering the industry. I now teach at UC Berkeley, and I will say more than half of my students work in the industry while they're in class with me. I have found that at least a third are working in the industry for several years after graduating from UC Berkeley. This is the industry that is available, and it is the lowest paying industry in America. And that, as we're seeing now, will have serious implications for our GDP, for our ability to consume. We've seen sections of this industry cannibalize themselves. That middle, we think of 3 tiers in the industry: fast food, family style or franchise, and fine dining. That middle tier of family style or franchise, the Olive Gardens and Red Lobsters of the world, have been stagnating because the working middle class that were often restaurant workers can no longer afford to take their families to eat before the pandemic. So it's important to understand the implications of being the largest and fastest growing industry with the lowest paying jobs. It's also important to understand the history. How did we get to a place where you've got the nation's largest and fastest growing industry with the lowest paying jobs? And it's really largely due to the money, power, and influence of a trade lobby called the National Restaurant Association. We call it the other NRA. It represents the chains, the IHOPs, the Applebee's, the Olive Gardens. And in doing research for my last book, we uncovered it's not been around 50 or 60 years, which is what I had originally thought before writing the book. It's been around 150 years since emancipation of slavery. Because tipping as a practice originated in feudal Europe, it was something that aristocrats and nobles gave to serfs and vassals, but always on top of a wage, never instead of a wage. It became a replacement for the wage only in the United States of America because of slavery. And I want to say, there's a part of this history that I didn't actually know about when I wrote Forked, which is that around 1850, waiters across the eastern seaboard of the United States, from Boston, New York, Philly, DC, went on strike. They had a wage. They were not relying on tips, and they wanted a higher wage, and they went on strike. And restaurant owners up and down this eastern seaboard, in response, replaced them with women. And so the feminization of the industry coincided with emancipation. And at emancipation, the restaurant lobby not only wanted to hire women, they wanted to hire Black women in particular and not pay them anything at all and have them live entirely on tips. So you've got Black people entering a paid workforce, supposedly, and women now taking over as tipped workers. And the combination drove a workforce that had a wage to a $0 wage. At that point, we were, as a country, mutating the concept of tipping. Tipping was mutated at that point from a notion of an extra or bonus on top of a wage to now becoming the wage itself. And that became law in 1938 as part of the New Deal, when everybody got the right to the minimum wage, except for 3 groups of Black workers: farm workers, domestic workers, and tipped restaurant workers, who were Black women, largely, We're told you get a $0 wage. As long as tips bring you to the full minimum wage, it's fine. And we went from 0 in 1938 all the way up to $2.13 an hour. And I love Massachusetts. Massachusetts is a leader on so many issues, but Massachusetts is an embarrassment on this issue because it is actually the state with the highest gap between all other workers who are now going up to $15 an hour, and tipped workers who remain around $5 or less in Massachusetts. Massachusetts continues to be one of 43 states in the United States that persist with this legacy of slavery. 7 states, including where I now live in California, have gotten rid of this system. California, Oregon, Washington, Nevada, Minnesota, Montana, and Alaska all require a full minimum wage with tips on top. We've done all kinds of regression analysis on those 7 states. We find that they have higher restaurant sales per capita, higher job growth in the industry, higher small business growth, higher rates of tipping, even though they all require a full minimum wage with tips on top. But the most significant thing that for me as a woman who is an intersectional feminist, the most important data point is that 70% of tipped workers all across the country are women. They're disproportionately women of color. They suffer from not only the highest rates of economic instability of any workforce, but also the highest rates of sexual harassment of any workforce. They largely work in casual restaurants, IHOPs, Denny's, Olive Gardens, and they have to tolerate all kinds of inappropriate customer behavior to feed their families in tips. Tips are now irrefutably, the evidence has just become a mountain of evidence that tipping is inherently racist and biased, that unfortunately we as Americans suffer from implicit bias. We have implicit biases, and therefore when we tip as customers, we tip white men more than Black women and women of color. We tip women based on how much they're willing to put up with our grabbing and our touching, and I'm talking about men largely as customers. And we found that the 7 states that require these women to receive a full minimum wage with tips on top have 1/2 the rate of sexual harassment in the restaurant industry. Because it turns out when you pay a woman a full minimum wage with tips on top, she doesn't have to put up with as much from the customer. She can reject the guy grabbing her butt because she knows she can count on a wage from her boss, like every other worker in every other industry. And even worse, for anybody who's listening who worked in the industry in your youth, we've now done all kinds of research, and we're partnering with Professor Catherine McKinnon, who some of you may know coined the phrase sexual harassment. We're doing a study with her to document the lifelong impacts of these early experiences of working off tips and suffering from sexual harassment. And what we're finding is that women later in life, and I'm talking about CEOs and senators, I've talked to Senator Klobuchar about this, they say, I have been sexually harassed later in life, but I did nothing about it because it was never as bad as it was when I was a young woman working in restaurants. Our industry sets the standard for what's acceptable economy-wide for women and men, because this is the first exposure young people have to the world of work. And it's a world in which your manager is consistently telling you dress more sexy, show more cleavage in order to make more money in tips. That is how you're going to be a valuable, good worker, is if you can make a lot of money in tips, and you can make more money in tips if you're willing to not only put up with this harassment, but frankly, in many ways, encourage it. So all of that was prior to the pandemic. We had a crisis of racial inequity, sexual harassment, economic instability, much worse for women of color. We just released a report in August. I got to tell you, it was shocking to me too. But because women of color are segregated into more casual restaurants, and because of the customer bias in tipping, which results in you can have a Black woman standing right next to a white man at a fine dining restaurant, and she will earn far less in tips. And all of that has resulted in a $5 per hour wage gap between white men and Black women tipped workers nationwide. And get this, an $8 per hour wage gap in Massachusetts. I am sad to say Massachusetts beats every other state in the nation, second only to Alabama, in having the highest race wage gap between Black women and white men as a result of a sub-minimum wage in Massachusetts that I don't think is a reflection of the kind of state of politics in Massachusetts on other issues. It's a reflection of the power of the restaurant industry, the power this industry has held over both parties, frankly, elected officials from both parties for generations. And I say generations because this wage has been frozen in multiple states and at the federal level for decades. At the federal level, it was frozen because of a man named Herman Cain, who many of you now know better. We've known Herman Cain for a while because he was the head of the Restaurant Association, and then he ran for president. And while he was the head of the Restaurant Association, he struck a deal with the Democrats in Congress and President Clinton saying, we, the Restaurant Association, will allow you to raise the minimum wage, which tells you who really runs our country. We'll allow you to raise the minimum wage as long as tipped workers are frozen forever. That was 1995, meaning the last time the wage went up at the federal level was 1991, 30 years ago. And we, in our membership, have literally 2 generations of women, mothers and daughters, who've lived on a $2 wage, which is the wage in most states. They've lived on this insane wage, relying on tips. So all of that was prior to the pandemic. It was an issue of social justice, racial justice, America needing to confront its slavery, demons of slavery, all before the pandemic. And with the pandemic, it went from an issue of racial justice and social justice to an issue of life or death, because 10 million restaurant workers lost their jobs. 60% were unable to access unemployment insurance because they couldn't. Most states told these workers that their sub-minimum wage plus tips was too low to meet the minimum threshold to qualify for benefits. And in many states, we had organized these workers and fought campaigns to raise the minimum wage. In many cases, we won. But state legislators listened to the Restaurant Association and reversed some of our wins, and then turned around and told these workers, your wages are too low to get benefits. So it was a slap in the face to thousands of workers. And now so many of these workers are being asked to return to work. They're being asked to go back to work for a sub-minimum wage, expose their lives for $2 and $3 and $4 wages, expose themselves to the virus when tips are down across the country 50 to 75%. And even worse, again, even if you couldn't care less about these workers, you should be worried, because the CDC reported 2 weeks ago that actually the only factor they have found to have the most impact on whether you get COVID is whether you ate in a restaurant. They said adults are twice as likely to get the virus from eating in a restaurant at this point. And we are expecting these tipped workers, who we pay $2, $3, $4, $5, depending on the state, to be our front line of defense from making Boston, New York City, COVID hotspots once again. We are expecting them to enforce social distancing and mask rules with the very same customers from whom they're supposed to get tips to survive, to feed their families, to make up their wage. It is absurd, and it is a public health disaster. So yesterday, we worked with 31 top public health doctors, including several from Harvard, who issued a letter to Governor Cuomo in New York, and you'll see another letter to the legislature in Massachusetts coming up next week, saying this is a public health disaster. You have got to pay these workers a full minimum wage so that they are not disincentivized from actually enforcing these rules. Can you imagine? You rely on tips, you try to enforce these rules. I hope you've seen the news. There's been so much harassment of these workers. Even a man died in upstate New York because he was trying to defend these workers against harassment. And another customer who was belligerent, didn't want to wear a mask, shoved him, and he fell down and died. These workers are getting severely harassed every time they enforce these mask rules. But put aside harassment, they need tips to survive from these customers. So if you are paid $4 or $5 in Massachusetts and you're expected to live off of tips, would you enforce these mask and social distancing rules? You might try because you know it's important for your own safety, But at a certain point, if you rely on these customers to get tips, you are not going to enforce these rules. You're going to be hesitant because of the belligerence that they're facing in trying to enforce these rules, let alone the tip issue. And that sexual harassment is now being compounded with this harassment around public health. We had a worker who told us that she got a note from a customer saying, I would have tipped you more if you had taken your mask off. You'd be a lot cuter. So the expectation that these women are going to entertain and put up with this kind of harassment has now gone to a level of, well, we expect you to risk your life for our entertainment so that we can be looking at your pretty face, or perhaps doing more while we are eating in indoor dining. So it is a moment of crisis, but we called this session Reimagining the Industry because as much of a crisis as it has been the most extraordinary moment of opportunity I have ever seen in my 20 years of organizing. I have seen such incredible new power from workers standing up, such incredible new openness from independent restaurant owners willing to change the system thanks to everything that I've just talked about, and lots of consumers finally understanding the essential nature of these workers. On the worker side, we started a relief fund for these workers on March 16th. Really unexpectedly, we ended up raising $23 million to hand out cash payments, and 220,000 workers applied for relief. And yes, we've been handing out cash payments to as many of them as we can, but maybe more importantly, we've been organizing them to strike. We've had strikes over the last couple of months saying we won't go back to work without one fair wage and safety protocols. We've been organizing them to vote in a peer-to-peer voter program. We've been organizing them to write and call their legislators and say we need one fair wage. So it's been an incredible moment of power, the ability to take crisis and organize people for change. But maybe the most surprising part has been employers. I think so many people might expect restaurant owners to double down and say there's no way to raise wages in this moment. And on the contrary, we've heard from literally hundreds and hundreds of restaurant owners around the country saying, we think it's time to move to a full minimum wage. It's clear this system was dysfunctional. Now it has just blown up in our face. We saw our employees not get unemployment insurance. We're seeing them having to fight with customers to get tips and then to enforce these rules. And I think between the pandemic and the murder of George Floyd and the national call for racial equity, we've had a lot of employers. I just had an employer in DC this morning say, I've changed my mind because I didn't know the slave history and it's time for the industry to move away from this legacy of slavery. So between the pandemic, the moment for racial equity, and frankly, a lot of employers are finding they can't get their workers to come back to work unless they pay them a full minimum wage. There is a level of demand and supply happening here too. But a lot of employers have decided to change their tune. And so as a result, we worked with Governor Newsom in California, Mayor de Blasio in New York City, now Mayor Duggan in Detroit. There's going to be a very exciting announcement next week in the city of Boston. We'll be announcing that on an event with Senator Warren next Friday. But we created a program with all of these mayors and governors called High Road Kitchens, where we are giving out cash grants to restaurant owners that commit to transitioning to a full minimum wage, commit to transitioning to increased race and gender equity through a race and gender equity toolkit we created for restaurants, and commit to providing a certain number of free meals. And this program is kind of a win-win-win: food security, raising wages, helping small businesses survive. It's a way in which, in general, we are reimagining the industry, as I said, by shaping relief efforts in a way that can shape a better industry for all coming out of this virus. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Saru. This was really fascinating, highly illuminating, and also a couple of things you brought up actually also lend themselves for me saying just a few sentences about how this topic connects with other things that have been going on in our series, which in turn reflect topics at the intersection between economic and racial justice that are happening in the world. But first of all, on the tipping culture compared to other countries, it's always a fascinating phenomenon to see if you have tourists coming to the United States, especially let's say from Germany or France, right? Where, the terms in German and French, right? So in German this is Trinkgeld, and in French it's pourboire, and both of these mean something for drinking, right? So it's something that you give to somebody in addition to what they normally have. This is expended on a drink, right? Something extra. And I thought it was the psychology of that is, these, say German and French tourists, they always need to be, you really need to make them understand that this is a different kind of relationship. It's not that they are, more greedy than other people and don't, it's not that they don't want the workers to be paid well, but they don't see themselves in that kind of relationship, right? They're not employees, they're customers in the restaurant.
That's great.
Right, that's very different. Yeah.
That's right. I'm so glad you raised that, because I didn't get to go into this history. But the truth is that, as I said, tipping originated in feudal Europe, an extra or a bonus on top of a wage. That if you watch like Downton Abbey, or, I don't know if you ever read like old English literature, even P.G. Wodehouse, if you read Jeeves and Wooster, you'll see these references to, here's 10 extra quid, old man. It's like an extra or a bonus, a gift on top of a wage.
Yeah.
Noblesse oblige is basically how it's thought of. And that idea came to the States in the 1850s when rich Americans started to travel to Europe and come back and try to show off that they knew the rules of Europe. And there was massive rejection of the idea in the United States. In fact, there was a populist movement to reject tipping in the United States. 6 states banned tipping completely in the United States, saying this is a vestige of feudalism. We're a democracy. We don't believe in this. We think you should get good service regardless of how much you can afford to tip. And by the way, we think employers should pay their customers, employers should pay their workers, not customers. And that movement, which gained a lot of momentum in the US, by the way, during that time, that populist movement, Alexis de Tocqueville came, wrote about American democracy and said, this is a hallmark of American democracy. There's no tipping here. We don't have this feudal idea here. Well, that populist movement spread to Europe. The labor movement picked it up in Europe in the early 20th century. And you heard this rallying cry among workers in hotels and restaurants in Europe. We are professionals. We don't live on tips. We are professionals. We deserve living wages. And that is how tipping really was gone for a long time in Europe. And as you just said, the relationship between the customer and the worker was one of a professional. So in the same way, we would never think of tipping a doctor or a lawyer or a professor who are engaged in customer service type activities. There is a sense in Europe that these workers are professionals. They go to school for many years to be a hospitality professional. There are schools of hospitality profession in Europe that are regarded and respected. And so there is a different relationship. It's only with Americans starting to, again, American tourism and tipping, have we started to see some amount of tipping come back in Europe. But you're right. European tourists coming to the United States largely don't tip. American workers hate it because they think Europeans are being cheap. But there isn't an understanding that, in fact, the European model, it has much more respect for workers. It's a respect that requires the employer to pay a professional, not even a minimum, but a professional wage to these skilled professionals. And that is the long-term goal here. We in the United States need to recognize this immense workforce as the skilled professionals that they are. And
then, of course, in a way, an extreme version of this other culture you have in places like Japan, where there is no tip implied at all. So in a way, the graciousness component in the relationship between the customer and the waiter is complete. So they're providing a professional service. And just like doctors and others, they get
that's great.
Right,
an income. Yes.
An income, exactly, right?
Yes, a salary, yes.
But then, so back to the United States. So what I've found quite fascinating, I've seen this in one of your writings that I browsed through recently, this connection to the racist history. That's it's also quite fascinating because there's so much soul searching around that at the moment. And in particular, the 1619 project of the New York Times has basically, the gist of that was to bring to our attention all the depth of the traces of enslavement. And actually in that and this is something I had just not known, that the origin of your NRA, that whole the tipping business, that is also actually rooted, and that just but once you see it, it actually makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Yes. How could it be that any worker in the United States makes $2.13 in this day and age, even if they get tips? Where does that absurd wage come from? It can only come from the fact that our nation was founded on free labor of some people, and so now we've expanded our fight to say we want to end all sub-minimum wages in the United States, because tipped workers are the largest group that get a sub-minimum wage. It's mostly restaurant, but also nail salon, car wash, hair salon, parking attendants. That's about a quarter of tipped workers in the United States all get sub-minimum wages. But apart from tipped workers, people with disabilities get a sub-minimum wage because of their identity as a person with a disability. Youth get sub-minimum wages in many states because of age discrimination. And incarcerated workers can be paid next to nothing because of another legacy of slavery, the exception to the 13th Amendment that allows for that allows for slavery in the case of incarceration. And so here in California, where I live, where we have massive wildfires, about 3,000 firefighters, a third of our firefighting force here in the state of California is incarcerated workers making $1 per day. And that is all of these sub-minimum wages. Tipped workers are mostly women, disproportionately women of color. Obviously, people with disabilities and youth are people who are disabled and youth. And then incarcerated workers are overwhelmingly Black and brown. These sub-minimum wages are not only legacies of slavery, they are direct valuations of some people as less than others. The sub-minimum wage is a valuation of women and people of color and women of color as less than human. Sub-minimum wage. And so I think it's time, as you said, for America to reckon with that.
It really is quite striking. If you kind of take a step back from that, right? So what is happening is that really they're not getting recognition as people who need to earn an income, as a certain professional status. Basically, they have to build a relationship with every single person, with every single customer, and then
that's right.
And what's fascinating about your statistical results is that reveals that leads to the bearing of all sorts of unpleasant tendencies in that kind of interaction that is not regulated at that level. Yeah.
That's right.
But what I actually wanted to ask you about this also, just try to understand the way this industry works a little bit better. So one thing, and I know you've also written about this, and we all experience that in our kind of dining experiences. There is something oddly lopsided about the male and white presence in the business and in the whole culinary sector, right? So we do know that women and people of color are way overrepresented in that sector. Right. But then if there's a famous chef, in way more cases than not, it's a white male. If you go to, if you get a birthday treat and you're being taken to, an upscale restaurant, the fine dining sector, more likely than not, the person who waits on your table is a white male. But that is just and this is not unusual. There's other sectors of society also where we have an overrepresentation of women and people of color. But the famous ones, the kind of the people in the big jobs, so to speak, are white males. So what is the mechanism? How does that come about in the food sector?
I'm so glad you asked that. So our industry is severely racially segregated, and it's so frustrating every time you hear the National Restaurant Association talk about how amazing it is that the industry provides so many incredible opportunities for people of color and women and people formerly incarcerated people. We're the largest employer of immigrants, the largest employer of formerly incarcerated people. We are, yes, people work in the industry, but obviously diversity and equity are two very, very different things, because our industry is severely racially segregated. Workers of color are segregated into lower paying segments of the industry, meaning fast food and casual restaurants rather than fine dining, but they're also segregated by position. They tend to be in what we call the back of the house, the kitchen, rather than the front of the house. Those terms even very much, harking back to plantation slavery, the house slaves and the field slaves. Often the house slaves were lighter skinned than those in the field. And in a similar way, you've got front of house workers who are largely white, back of house workers who are people of color. And it's funny because every time in the past, before George Floyd's murder, when I would talk to restaurant owners about this issue, many of them would speak as if there was no other way to do it, that this kind of white people in the front, people of color in the back was the only way to run a restaurant. And I always used to say, God didn't tell you to put people of color in the front, back, and white people in the front. That is your choice in the way that you've recruited and hired and trained. And so we have to rethink who we're recruiting for what positions, how we're hiring people, how we're training people, and what we know about implicit bias and overcoming implicit bias is that race neutral policies that just say, we're going to do this based on merit, don't actually end up having the equity outcomes that we need to actually have people of color working in fine dining or in the front of the house. Race neutral policies don't take into account the many generations of structural and historical racism in this country that have resulted in people of color not applying in large numbers to fine dining restaurants, often because they don't feel comfortable applying, not having the training or many people of color don't grow up drinking wine or going to fine dining restaurants. So they're not often exposed to wine varietals or the table talk, which is such a coded term that's necessary to talk to people in a fine dining setting. And there's a vicious cycle where workers don't apply. They self-select against those jobs because they know they'd get rejected. Employers don't choose those workers, nor do they intentionally or actively recruit those workers. And you result with what the result is a very segregated workforce. And as I mentioned earlier, not just a segregated workforce, but that does have real outcomes for people. An $8 per hour wage gap between Black women and white men in Massachusetts over a decade means the difference between being able to buy a home and not buy a home. An $8 wage gap is the difference between, having healthcare, being able to send your kids to college. All of the aspects of multi-generational poverty are very connected to this segregation that is a legacy of slavery and does result in severely different outcomes for workers. And so that's why the program we run with employers, the Racial Equity Toolkit, actually conducts an implicit bias test with employers and managers and with customers. And then it helps walk these employers through the process of changing their recruitment, hiring, training, promotion, and evaluation practices so that they can have a more equitable restaurant.
Let me ask you one more thing, and then I will turn back to Sushma. So what is quite intriguing is that your empirical investigations have found that in those 7 states in which in which that tipping system has actually been abandoned in favor of a fixed salary system, actually everything is going better. A lot of things are going better. So the restaurants are doing better, and the waiting staff is doing better. So you find better sales in restaurants, and you find fewer complaints of harassment, or happier employees, clearly. So that leads then to 2 questions, really. One is, can you explain a little bit the mechanisms of that? What's happening in a restaurant scene in a state when we are moving to this new phase?
Yeah.
And whatever it is, why isn't, if it's working so well, why isn't everybody doing it?
Yeah. So first, to clarify, it's not that the 7 states have moved away from tipping altogether. They've moved away from the sub-minimum wage for tipped workers. So in California, Oregon, Washington, Nevada, Minnesota, Montana, and Alaska, everybody in every industry, including the restaurant industry, is required to pay a full minimum wage with tips on top. And that in California has been around for 40 years. And over the last 40 years, we've seen California have the largest and fastest growing restaurant industry of any state. The chains are growing, small businesses growing faster. As I mentioned, tipping rates are actually higher. And I think it really does come back to the Henry Ford model, which Henry Ford was a Nazi. Let's be very clear about who Henry Ford was. He was a Nazi sympathizer, actually met with Adolf Hitler, very clear racist, but he did do something that other capitalists of his time did not, which is he said, I want to make sure that my workers can afford the Model T cars coming off the assembly line. I'm going to pay them enough that they can afford to buy the cars. And our industry, as I said earlier, is cannibalizing itself by not increasing workers' wages. They are really killing the workforce, the largest workforce in America, that is their largest consumer base. And anybody who's worked in this industry knows restaurant workers eat out more than other people. They socialize together at other restaurants. They tip more than other people because they know exactly what it means to get tips, or to live off of tips. So it comes down to the Henry Ford model that if you pay people better in these 7 states, your industry will succeed. It will grow. It will thrive. You'll have less turnover. We did a huge study with Cornell University. We surveyed about 1,100 employers nationwide. We found that you can cut your employee turnover in half by paying a full minimum wage. And we have the highest rates of employee turnover of any industry in the United States. It's 300%. That's 3 turns in one position in 1 year. And what goes uncalculated is the cost of hiring and retraining, morale. Turnover has a lot of both tangible and intangible costs that we quantified as about $12,000 per year for a small restaurant of 20 or 30 people. You can imagine the chains, they're paying millions of dollars in turnover costs that they could save by paying their workers a full minimum wage and letting them stay in one place rather than hopping from place to place, always looking for a better job. So that's why it works in the 7 states. And we were able last year to finally convince the US House of Representatives of the wisdom of that. And they passed the Raise the Wage Act in July of last year, which was the first time in US history that either House of Congress moved to eliminate this legacy of slavery, the sub-minimum wage for tipped workers. So we won it in the House. Of course, we couldn't get it to move in the Senate because of Mitch McConnell, but it did pass in the House. It's now on the docket to be passed in multiple states. I think the experience that has been so different and so much more positive in those 7 states, and the research we've done to show it, is finally bearing fruit. And these other states are seeing in the pandemic how the system really never worked.
Thank you, Saru. So advocacy groups and rights organizations often focus on naming and shaming. So I'm wondering if there's a campaign you've been part of or have led that's been successful, where you've put pressure on a particular corporation to address exploitative practices. And on a related note, are there examples you can uplift of restaurants that are doing the right thing?
Yeah, thank you so much for asking that. So this was the whole basis for my book, Forked. We produced, for over the last many years, we've been producing a Diner's Guide app called our ROC National Diner's Guide that lists restaurants and how they're faring on issues of wages, benefits, and promotions. And it both shames restaurant companies, mostly chains, that have the worst record on these things, and it uplifts amazing restaurant owners, mostly independent, non-chain restaurants that are doing the right thing on these issues. I will say we do have one full service chain now, Buffalo Wild Wings in New York, that's decided to kind of join the high road. But for the most part, these are amazing independent high road restaurants. But on the shaming side, yes, we have for many years, waged campaigns against large high profile restaurant owners and chefs. One that comes to mind is Mario Batali, who unfortunately, even before he was called out for pretty severe sexual harassment during the Me Too moment, was stealing workers' tips and discriminating against workers of color and sexually harassing all kinds of women. And we, organized campaign, picket lines in front of the restaurant, litigation, ended up with a $4 million settlement, and much more importantly, all kinds of changes in the company and a pronouncement by Mario Batali that he would now move towards the high road. Of course, after that, during the Me Too moment, he was exposed for decades of sexual harassment that then forced him to leave his company. But it was a real, that is just one of 20 or 30 large high profile restaurant owners who we have put pressure on to change their ways. and move to the high road. Now you'll notice I'm using the word high road because we don't think it's a destination. We don't think anybody's perfect. We don't expect anybody to be perfect. I'm an employer. I'm not perfect. No employer is. We're human. What we expect of people taking the high road is that they're consistently trying to do better by their employees. And if employees approach them about something that's wrong, they try to work to improve it to the best of their ability. And so that is the now 800-900 employers who we've been working with, who we call high road restaurants, who we give silver and gold stars to in our guide. They pay livable wages. They pay one fair wage in many instances. They have gone through our equity programming. They provide benefits. They have proven that it is not inherent or organic, no pun intended, to the nature of running a restaurant to have to pay people poverty wages and to have to not provide benefits. It is entirely up to an employer to do the right thing. And to the extent that employers don't know how to do it, we now have free training and materials and support, and even now funding to provide restaurants to move towards the high road. So yes, we do a lot of shaming. We do a lot of upliftment. And I do want to just name the current naming and shaming campaign, which is Darden, which is the world's largest full service restaurant company. They own Olive Garden. They own Red Lobster until very recently, Capitol Grill Steakhouse, Longhorn Steakhouse, Eddie V's, Season 52's, Bahama Breeze, Yard House, huge company. They've been the leader in campaigning to keep the wage at $2.13 an hour. And we worked with Harvard lawyers actually to sue them recently on a very creative legal theory that says the very existence of the subminimum wage and forcing workers of color and women to live off of tips in the restaurants is in and of itself as a policy a violation of equal protection. So we just filed those lawsuits yesterday, and workers were striking in front of Darden restaurants in New York, Chicago, DC, and Philly last Wednesday. And we'll continue to push because, I think sometimes there's this sense that there's no way to push corporate America to do the right thing. Like they're just going to listen to their shareholders. I think sometimes people feel hopeless in terms of what corporations do, but Darden's a perfect example. For years, they vitriolically lobbied against paid sick leave, requiring companies to pay workers for a day off when they're sick. And that led to, honestly, like public health disasters in the restaurant industry prior to the pandemic. They fought and fought and fought against that. When the pandemic happened, they suddenly overnight announced we're moving to provide paid sick leave to all of our employees across the country. So clearly, if they can do that, they can also pay a full minimum wage.
So Julie in our audience asked a related question to my earlier question, so I'll ask it now, which is about the Gramercy Restaurant Group and Danny Myers and others moving to a no-tip policy at the fine dining level. So what's the connection or impact of that on your work?
Yeah, so it's an interesting story, actually. We had been fighting for, as you know, 2 decades to get rid of this sub-minimum wage for tipped workers. And in 2015, Darren Walker, the president of the Ford Foundation, said, Saru, you really need to talk to Danny Meyer. And Danny's HR manager had been coming to our meetings kind of in secret. Nobody knew. The company didn't know. She just wanted to learn. But Danny and I had never met, never spoken. Later, he told the New York Times that he was afraid of me. But because he knew Darren and he trusted Darren, he sat down with me and I told him everything I've just told you. I told him the legacy of slavery and the sexual harassment. And he said, I've hated this system for 20 years. You've given me the impetus to move away from it. And he invited me to come speak to all of his management team in New Paltz, New York, upstate. And I went, and the manager of the Modern at the MoMA was there. And he said, I'm inspired. I want to be the first to move away from this system. And just to be extremely clear, we as a policy matter are fighting for a full minimum wage with tips on top. That's what exists in California and the 7 states. But Danny said, I want to go further than that. I just want to get rid of tipping altogether because it clearly creates all kinds of biases and problems. And so he moved all the way to a gratuity-free model, and it got a lot of international press. We supported him on that because beyond paying workers a full minimum wage, we're agnostic. If you want to get rid of tips, that's fine. If you want to move to a service charge model, that's fine. Or if you just want to move to a full minimum wage with tips on top, that's how it's done for most people in the 7 states. That's fine too. So we were supportive of Danny's move as long as he could make sure that workers were getting what they used to get in the old model or better, and that everybody was getting a full minimum wage. He was surprised that, I mean, several restaurant companies did follow him. Some reversed course because they did it too quickly. He tried to stick with it, and only recently during the pandemic did he say, I'm not going to go all the way back to a sub-minimum wage, but I am going to go back to a full minimum wage with tips on top instead of a gratuity-free model, because it was really hard during the pandemic and the lack of sales. So I think a lot of restaurants feel like the long-term vision is just getting rid of tipping altogether, moving to what we talked about earlier in Europe. But everybody understands that a really good, important first step is to make sure everybody is paid a full minimum wage, and tips can be on top of that instead of a replacement for the wage.
Thank you so much for that. You mentioned in your earlier remarks about the exemptions for not just people in the restaurant industry, but also farm workers and domestic workers. And I'm wondering if you can just speak briefly to, of course, we are well aware of the situation facing farm workers, and you talked about COVID. We've seen these images of people working in the farms, and you see the fires behind, and you see people kind of masked, and it's very dire working conditions. So can you just share a little bit about what is happening in those sectors, and is there opportunity for sort of cross-issue solidarity and organizing?
Yeah, absolutely. So we built something called the Food Chain Workers Alliance, which is like a coalition of workers throughout the food chain: farm workers, meat and poultry processing workers, food retail and distribution workers, restaurant workers, cafeteria workers, kind of a whole gamut, the whole food supply chain. And we've been together pushing for, increased wages, benefits, health and safety issues. For farm workers in particular, they did get left out of the minimum wage law. They have their own farm worker kind of laws that apply to them, and they are getting the minimum wage at this point, but they, in a lot of states, are not able to have overtime pay. So if they work more than 40 hours, unlike other workers, they can't necessarily get time and a half. And in a lot of places, they don't have the right to unionize. So there's a lot of work to do for farm workers. There's a lot of work to do for domestic workers. And you're right, especially along the food chain, from farm workers to meat and poultry processing workers to restaurant workers, there are severe COVID risks. Workers in the fields are contracting the disease, have no access to health care, are living in close quarters with each other, working in close quarters, and being forced by the likes of Trump, not just farm workers, but also meat and poultry processing workers, to just keep going. And they're forcing these, even when sometimes the companies don't want to stay open, they're forcing some of these meat and poultry processing plants to stay open so that we can have our meat, even when hundreds of workers are contracting the disease and many are dying. And so when you look all the way up the food chain, my hope is that, when we finally begin to understand through this pandemic that hopefully, if we learn nothing else, we learn that we are interdependent, that farm workers getting sick affects us. Meat and poultry processing workers getting sick affects us. Restaurant workers getting sick affects us. Also, their reticence to enforce masks and social distancing rules is going to affect us, because if we're forcing them to live off of our tips, they're not going to enforce those rules. So our health depends on the health of these workers. I'm glad we're finally talking about them as essential, but I want to say, recognizing the essential nature of these workers cannot mean clapping for them. It cannot mean calling them essential. It cannot mean we honor them and we feel for them. It means that we have to fight to make sure they get paid and they have the safety protocols that they need and the health care that they need to keep themselves safe, and therefore to keep us safe as well.
Thank you. So another question from our audience is about the tip jar at coffee shops. So can you talk about a bit about how that works and about minimum wage in
Yeah,
those stores?
it's so interesting because until Trump, though, there was not, it was widely recognized that a tip jar in a coffee shop did not result in baristas in a coffee shop getting a sub minimum wage. But we have increasingly seen, especially under Trump, the move to have lots of sectors try to copy the restaurant industry and the boondoggle they have with the sub minimum wage and get that ability to pay their workers less. And one thing that's made this much worse, unfortunately, is Apple Pay. Apple Pay has introduced higher levels of tipping in coffee shops and retail environments that never had tipping before. I remember walking into a flower shop or a coffee shop and never being asked, how much do you want to tip for purchasing a bottle of water or a sandwich in a coffee shop? But now the automatic thing that the employee is actually forced to do is to turn the screen to you and ask you, how much do you want to tip? And that has resulted in, we have seen coffee shops in DC and other cities, therefore reduce their workers' wages down from the full minimum wage to the sub minimum wage because of Apple Pay. And because under Trump, suddenly Apple Pay, which has replaced the tip jar, now means these workers can be classified as tipped workers. And it's gotten worse. We saw DoorDash and Instacart and gig companies try to copy this same idea, cutting their delivery workers' payments based on how much you as the customer tip them. And so as long as we allow restaurant workers to get less because of tips, you are going to see more and more. We even saw one airline attempt to do this, because now when the airline attendants come and bring you the screen to order food, sometimes it asks you, do you want to leave a tip? And that has led to some airlines attempting to say we should be able to pay these folks a sub minimum wage. So as long as the very notion of tipping leading to a sub minimum wage exists for restaurant workers, we're going to see more and more sectors try to copy it, and we've just got to stop it across the board.
Thank you. So this is really tremendously illuminating. I think nobody who interacts with your work on restaurants will ever look at restaurants the same way, right? And we see them more as a social justice zone once we think of it like that. And one striking thing, so you kept mentioning that also. So essential workers, right? This is a really kind of a curious development, and it's not just the restaurant sector, and it's not just in the United States. We're seeing that all around the world. This nomenclature, right? That these guys were classified as essential workers, and what this means really is that they had to show up, they had to be there.
Yes.
That was and in a way, it's just a certain perversity in capitalism that has absolutely nothing to do with how we pay them, and so it makes you then rethink how should we pay them. And one thing that I know you do often in your work, you also draw attention to the enormous cultural relevance of the restaurant scene, especially in the United States, which is a very, a culture where people go out a lot for the mundane day-to-day, for the special occasions. There's always people involved who, as you like to say, they touch your food, they bring it to you, right? They're essentially involved in your life. Right. And yet we're just not looking at the situation like that, right?
That's right. We need to push that frame.
Yeah.
And in fact, we worked with an artist. I don't know if I can share my screen, but we worked with an artist to build a 24-foot art piece called Elena, the Essential Worker. She's a woman of color whose stance is basically recalling Rosie the Riveter. She's the new Rosie the Riveter. She's Elena the Essential. We've built huge 24-foot statues of her in New York, Chicago, DC, and Philly. And on October 17th at the Women's March, we'll be rolling her out in Boston. So for those of you going to the Women's March in Boston, you'll see her, huge Elena, the Essential Worker, and we're making posters of her and pushing her out to say, listen, we're essential, pay us. If we're essential, pay us, respect us. And I did just want to say something, because I know we're almost out of time, that if there are students at the Kennedy School or anybody affiliated with the Kennedy School who are in Massachusetts and would like to get involved with the push in Massachusetts the Women's Caucus of the Massachusetts State Legislature has decided to make this issue one of their top 3 priority legislative issues in the new session coming up in January. We'd love to work with Kennedy School students to push that in Massachusetts.
So, Saru, before I wrap up, I'm just wondering if you can just share 1 or 2 resources for people who are watching, who are consumers perhaps, right? How do you ensure when you go to your next meal out, whenever that'll be post-pandemic, how do you ensure you're doing it in a socially responsible way?
Yeah, I so appreciate that. You definitely check out our website, onefairwage.org or .com to just learn, read more. But the best place to go as a consumer is highroadkitchens.com. And there you'll see we're starting to put all the restaurants that are getting funded to do the right thing. And, you know, once you know the restaurants that are doing the right thing, we ask you to do 2 things. 1, support those restaurants, but more importantly, wherever you eat out, you should eat out wherever you want to eat out, wherever you eat out, show that website on your phone to the employer, the owner, the manager, say, hey, I love eating here. I want to keep coming here. I want to keep ordering. If you're ordering out, or keep ordering from this restaurant, but I want to see you become part of this High Road Association. I want you, my favorite restaurant, to join forces with great employers like Tom Colicchio, star of Top Chef, and Juliet in Boston, and Danny Meyer and Alice Waters in California, who are part of an association that is pushing to reimagine the restaurant industry. So we want you to speak up wherever you eat out and tell not the server, not the workers, but the manager or employer that you want to see them be a part of this reimagination.
Thank you so much, Saru J. Raman, for your work and all of your inspiring remarks. Really appreciate you joining us. And